Medusa befriends a blind princess after she accidentally wanders into her cave. Unfortunately for the princess suitors, Medusa now developed a crush and doesn't tend to take well to competition. Part 1. The cave was warm and comfortable and smelled like home. That's what guided me to it in the first place, after falling from my horse and frantic with panic when it ran off. I considered myself lucky that I was uninjured above all else, but without her to guide me, I could be yards from the palace and never know it. I knew everyone would be looking for me, so that comforted me, but felt the rain coming and knew getting caught out in it would be miserable. "Hello?" I called. "I feel a fire nearby, so I know someone's here. I need help." "You're the princess." I froze at the female voice so close by, mere yards away. "What are you doing here?" the voice asked, wary and confused. "I fell from my horse," I explained, fidgeting with my hands. "I'm quite glad to have found someone." "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to be rude," the woman said quietly. "Let me show you to a seat." And that was the start of it all. Medusa was a friend that first day, but became more as each day passed. If pressed, I'll admit that it wasn't long before I was hoping the search party from the castle would delay in finding me. Then, as days became weeks, I simply never wanted to leave. When I lived in the castle, I'd always known suitors would come to court me, hidden away from what those my parents considered unworthy. I'd never considered that I might be the one to court someone else, to stumble upon their home and fall in love. Of course, they found me eventually. I was working in the garden when I heard the snap of a twig nearby. "Medusa, did you find the basket for the strawberries?" Quick footsteps approached me, and a hushed male voice spoke close to my ear. "I'm here to rescue you, princess," he said. He took my hand. "Come with me." "I don't need to be rescued," I told him, yanking my hand from his. "My parents would never approve of my love of a commoner, but I wish to stay." "This must be witchcraft," the man growled. "You could never fall in love with such a hideous creature." "Hideous?" I cried. "The snakes she was cursed with say nothing about soul, which is beautiful." He clamped a hand over my mouth. "Quiet or she'll hear you." I struggled, but he wouldn't yield, pulling me with him, presumably back toward his horse. "Belinda?" Medusa shouted in panic. I bit his hand and he let out a yelp. "Medusa, they've found me! I'm sorry!" Then suddenly, the man was still. I yanked myself free of his grip, stumbling backwards, and fell into Medusa's arms. "They've found us," I choked out. "I'm so sorry. I never should have stayed here." No, I'm sorry, Belinda," she hurriedly interrupted me, taking me comfortingly in her arms. "I should have known how this would end." "End? No, I'll talk to my parents. They must understand that my love for you is." "Belinda, I lied to you." I froze. "What?" "I've kept something from you," she whispered. Her words were hesitant and trembled with the threat of tears. "The man did not run off just now. You didn't hear his footsteps retreat, did you?" Confused, I pulled back from Medusa's arms. "What happened?" Guiding my hands, she led me a few steps away to where the man still stood, and my fingers brushed against what felt like granite. My eyes narrowed as I traced the carving, and then suddenly the edges took shape in my mind into the form of a face. I took in a sharp breath, drawing back. "That was you?" I whispered. "You are immune because of your blindness," she told me. "But I don't want to lose you. I have no right to ask this of you, but I beg you, please stay with me." I cut her off by cupping her face in my hands and kissing her deeply. After a long moment, I took a breath, leaning my forehead against hers. "I love you," I whispered. "That won't change. They can send more guards, they can send soldiers, they can send mercenaries, but that won't change how I feel about you." "I love you too," she breathed. "But is that enough? Can I keep you safe from those who will come to rescue you?" "It has to be enough," I murmured. "I refuse to lose you." As time passed, more came, and each time Medusa turned them to stone. Dozens of statues sat crowding the area surrounding her cave, a warning to any who might think to trespass. Some even fled, begging me to come with them, but when I refused, overcome with fear themselves, until one day someone new arrived. I heard him before he came too close, calling out a warning and telling him that he would only be the latest among many soldiers who had tried to take me away. "I'm not a soldier, princess," he said, his voice to my left, against the wall at the entrance to the cave. "I'm a commoner." "What? Why would my parents send a commoner?" I asked. "Because he's blind," Medusa spoke up beside me. My face slowly went slack with shock. "Is that true?" "It is." I heard his footsteps come closer to us. "Your parents are desperate to rescue you from the clutches of the woman who holds you captive." "She does not hold me captive," I snapped. I love her, and they call it witchcraft, the man said softly. I let out a sound of frustration and stamped my foot. They call anything they don't understand witchcraft. Then you must come back with me, the man told me, and explain it to them, or they will continue to send more men to die. When phrased in such a way, the truth hit me hard in the chest. My parents were haughty and convinced of their superiority from their royal blood, but I knew they truly loved me and wanted me to be safe. They would continue to send rescuers, one after another, until the forest was packed with the corpses of men who thought themselves saviors at the direction of their king and queen. Medusa must have seen something in my face, because she spoke up at that point. I knew this day would come, she muttered, despite my best efforts to ignore it. I will not abandon you, I told her, taking her by the shoulders. I will convince them of my love for you, and I will return. And if they refuse to let you? Medusa asked. I'm their daughter, I said firmly. Despite everything, I know they would want what is best for me, and that is to be with the woman I love. Medusa didn't reply, the silence weighing heavily upon us with unspoken thoughts and emotions too deep to put into words. She gently kissed my lips once and brushed the hair from my face, taking me in an embrace. No matter what happens, I had more time with you than I thought I would, she murmured in my ear. Any amount of time with the woman I love would have been a gift from the heavens, but I had many months. I will hold tight to those memories for the rest of my days. I'll come back for you, I said, hugging her tight and pulling back. I will. And with that, I followed the blind man back to his horse, and we mounted it, starting our journey back by following a soldier who sat upon a horse of his own, sent along as a guide. My heart sunk with each step the animals took back toward the castle, but I forced myself to believe that I would return. I recalled every loving moment my parents shared with me, every kindness, every assurance that they wanted what was best for me. It wasn't as if they would lock me away in some tower until they found a replacement for the one I loved. They would understand. They had to. Enjoying the story? Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment. All right, let's dive back into the story. Medusa and the Princess, Part 2. Once the hoofbeats had faded to nothing and Medusa had stood at the edge of her cave, tears streaming down her face, she wandered back inside and lay down on the couch. She curled up against the agony that pounded against her chest, clawing her from the inside out, ripping her soul to shreds. For years, she'd lived here in solitude, lonely but not miserable. How awful it was now, knowing what she could have. Knowing that love so deep was still within her grasp in her hideous form, only to have it taken from her. She wasn't foolish. She knew the king and queen would never allow for them to reunite. This was their end. Medusa sobbed, the thin snakes on her hair drooping and curling around each other tight to her skull, feeling her pain. She lay motionless on the couch for hours, until her stomach drew her up and over to the food the two of them had collected from the garden that day. Her appetite was tempered, but it was late in the day and she hadn't had lunch, so she managed to force down some carrots and strawberries. And as the days passed, she fell back into her old routines, desperately trying to force herself to ignore the signs of the missing presence in her home. She found company in the squirrels and birds who trusted her deeply enough to feed from her hands, but she still kept things in the same spots, lest Belinda be unable to find something or stumble into a chair. She found herself thinking of what to make for dinner, wanting to delight Belinda with a new, creative recipe, and then her heart would fall. She still woke and reached for someone in her bed who was not there. The days passed, the weeks passed, and Medusa reacclimated to a life of loneliness. My arrival back at the castle was celebrated beyond anything I could have imagined, and my parents barely left my side for hours. My mother went on and on of how brave I'd been and how many determined men went in search of me before they managed to outsmart the witch. And there was nothing I could do to dissuade them from their assumptions of the woman I loved. It was witchcraft. That was the only explanation. And pity mixed with condescension were the only emotions I heard in the voices of my parents. The celebration that night was unprecedented, and I was forced to play a part. I pasted a smile on my face and greeted every visitor with cheer, knowing that they didn't deserve my anger as much as it churned inside me every time Medusa's name came up in conversation. Or rather, that witch. I went to sleep that night with tears in my eyes, my mind desperate for a plan, but lacking in any strategy. The next day was even worse. Because I realized the life I'd returned to was not the one I'd left, my parents assigned 2 guards to me at all times, convinced that since I still felt love toward the witch, it was only a matter of time until I fell back into her clutches. I'd heard rumors of people who thought the only way to cure me of my affliction was to kill the witch, and despite my confidence in Medusa to protect herself, I didn't want to tempt fate. A life away from my love was better than her being sentenced to an early grave, so I began to drop hints to those around me that I no longer wished to return to her. But as time passed, as my home turned into a prison, and as my guards became my constant companions, my love for her did not dissipate, but instead it grew. I ached to feel her in my arms again, to taste her on my lips, to live together in peace in our home. Our home. The words echoed through my head, and eventually I realized the truth. The castle was no longer my home in any sense of the word. Suitors began to arrive occasionally, and I put on a good show, even as I took a liking to one as a friend, but nothing more, eventually admitting that I saw no future for us. I even ceased any talk of Medusa, grateful that the calls for her head had fallen silent once they realized they may lose more men for nothing, since she seemed to pose no more harm. Through all that time, I planned, I schemed, I desperately tried to form a plan that could bring me back to her. And from my desperation came a plan that had been inadvertently planted in my mind by my parents. Witchcraft. I needed the help of a witch. Though I was guarded most of the day, my lady-in-waiting and I had evenings to ourselves. She helped me heat water for my evening bath and spoke to me about my day. And despite my attempts to fool her as I had the others, she knew better. The evening I confessed the truth to her, sat in my cast-iron tub as we prepared my bath, naked physically and then emotionally. "I still love her, Clarice," I whispered. The young woman came to my side, wringing out the damp towel in her hands. "I know, my lady." My eyes started to tear, and I turned toward her. "They will never let me return to her. They would rather keep me here a prisoner, grow old with no companion at all, than to consider that I fell in love with a woman's soul when she has such a hideous appearance." I shook my head. "To them, she does. To me, her snakes are gentle, no less so than a garter snake you would carefully remove from a kitchen cupboard. There was no spell cast, no magic inflicted upon me. I fell in love, and it was taken from me." Tears slipped down my face, and I reached for Clarice. She gave me her hand to hold. "Clarice, I cannot live a life like this," I whispered. "You've known my secret for almost as long as I have, my fondness for women rather than men. You know I am not bewitched. Please, tell me you know that." Clarice let out a long, slow breath. "I do," she murmured. "But this woman, this is different. She was cursed by the gods, and you will never be permitted to return to her. I would even consider speaking to your parents about your preference for women, but I know that is not what would satisfy you. Love does not allow good enough. It draws 2 people together, despite class or race or circumstance or appearance." My lower lip trembled. "I need your help, Clarice. I have a plan, but I'll need your help." She fell silent for a long moment before she spoke again. "What is your plan, exactly?" My plan was terrible and cruel to my parents and all those in the kingdom who cared for me, but it was the only one I could consider. They would need to think me dead and need to think Medusa's cave abandoned, and that would take severe magic to perform, but I knew I had to try. The riches of the castle were available to me with little effort, which was necessary for the plan because I needed them for payment to the witch. Clarice played her part as a messenger, going to the most powerful witch of the land, a venture for which I thanked her many times, knowing she could be risking her life. I felt guilty asking so much of her, but she assured me that she was not only in my employ, but she was my friend, and she wished for nothing more than to see me happy. Several days later, I took the tonic the witch had concocted, with no choice but to trust her. As the days passed by, I showed signs of fever that developed into something even the best doctors in the land had no remedy for. Eventually, to all who watched over me in my bed, I let out my last breath. My parents were overcome with despair, shattered and broken, and I had no choice but to lay limply on my bed, my ears listening to my mother as she sobbed into my shoulder. I was placed in a casket that was meant for me to use many decades from now. The funeral procession was the next day, and I listened to the sounds of mourners with sadness in my heart. They'd lost their princess, I knew, and there was nothing I could do to fix that pain for them. And my parents had lost a child they'd controlled and disbelieved and trapped in a miserable existence, but I knew they cared for me. And yet, I kept to the plan. The process of filling in the hole around the lowered casket is a surprisingly long one, and so was the process of digging it up again, done in the dead of night with only moonlight to illuminate the graveyard. Clarice, of course, had help in this. Guards whom I trusted, but were also bribed generously, and they lifted my body from my coffin with care. The second tonic was lifted to my lips and sat in my mouth, soaking in until the muscles regained their use and allowed me to swallow. The taste was abhorrent, just like the first one, but it did exactly as it had been designed. My eyes fluttered open, staring at nothing, and I smiled. "Clarice? I'm here, my lady," she whispered. With that, the guards closed my coffin and refilled the hole as Clarice helped me up onto a horse, sharing a saddle with me, and we ran off into the night. The plan was not complete yet, though. We knew very well that my death would be assumed the fault of the witch who had kept me hostage, revenge for being overpowered and outsmarted. Our horse galloped through the night, and when we finally arrived, my lady wrapped a blindfold around her head to ensure her safety before we dismounted. "Medusa?" I called. "Medusa, are you there?" There was a shuffling that I recognized when the bed creaked under her weight. Then quick footsteps as she ran to me. "Belinda!" she cried. She grabbed me in her arms and I held her tightly, breathing her in. We stood in the embrace for what felt like ages, and all I wanted to do was stay there forever, clutching her so close that we became one. "Who is this?" Medusa finally whispered, drawing back. "My name is Clarice," she introduced herself. "I was part of the scheme to allow Belinda to return to you." "Scheme? What scheme?" "They think me dead, Medusa," I said softly. She gasped and then fell silent for a long moment. "Your parents?" "My parents kept me prisoner, kept me from you," I said, sliding my fingers up to gently tangle in the thin snakes floating about her skull. "No longer. But they will come for you. That is the next part of the plan, and Clarice needs to leave first." I turned around, finding my way to her and taking her in my arms. "Thank you, my friend. You have no idea the gift you've given me, and I wish you the best of luck through your life." "I wish you the same," she murmured in my ear. Medusa guided her back to the horse and came back to the cave before I heard the sound of hoofbeats as the horse went back the way it had come. "What comes next?" she asked me. I took a glass tonic bottle from my pocket and turned to my left, pouring it out on the ground, letting it spread and soak slowly into the crevices of the rocks that lined the floor. "This home is ours, forevermore. May none who arrive see through our door. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, the facade will be worn, in their senses they'll trust. This home is ours, forevermore. May none who arrive see through our door." The two members of the royal guard dismounted slowly and quietly from their horses, communicating only through meeting each other's eyes and motioning with their hands. They crept through the garden of statues, shivers sliding down their spines at the sight, and each drew their sword from the scabbards across their back. But as they arrived at the edge of Medusa's home, their swords lowered. The garden was untended, the fruits and vegetables rotting on the vines, and a coating of dust lay thick on everything in the cave. As they took step by careful step, one of them took in a sharp breath and the other followed his gaze. On the couch lay a corpse of a woman, unmistakable with the shriveled bodies of the snakes around her head like a perverted version of a halo. The witch is dead," one of them muttered in confusion. "Maybe the spell took too much of her power," the other suggested. "Witchcraft is dangerous business." "That much is true," the first sighed. "The king and queen will be able to rest easily knowing their child's murderer lays dead." "Good, because I'd very much like to retreat at this point," the second man said, sliding his sword back into the scabbard. "Just being in the presence of this place gives me a chill. You'll have no argument from me on that matter." The two turned and left, walking back to their horses. And watching them leave, Medusa and Belinda stood, hands clasped, with Belinda's head laid gently on her lover's shoulder. Thank you for listening to the story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter. Your support means a lot.